All right, welcome everyone. It's 1:30. We'll get started. We welcome you to our presentation about building your building and coronavirus. We're providing this presentation today to challenge you to think about how you can reopen your buildings to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and other contagious pathogens. We have just experienced not a natural disaster to our communities and ourselves, but a biological disaster. And just like natural disasters affect buildings, and those effects can only be mitigated. In this case, it's the same situation. Those effects can only be mitigated but not eliminated. So solutions require coordinated approaches between building features and operational procedures. The presenters today are myself, Rebecca Rand Costigan. I'm Chief Engineer of Criterium Engineers. Criterium Engineers is a national engineering consulting firm providing engineering services for existing buildings and new construction with over 35 offices throughout the United States. I'm a licensed professional engineer, mechanical engineer, licensed in multiple states with over 20 years, probably close to 25 years of experience in building and systems engineering. Also concurrently an adjunct professor at the University of Maine Mechanical Engineering Technology Department as the lead HVAC design instructor. Alan Mooney is my co-presenter today. Alan is the founding president of Criterium Engineers. He's a civil structural engineer, also licensed in multiple states, with an impressive track record on construction-related issues, construction quality, building inspection procedures, and standards. He's also the founding president of the National Academy of Building Inspection Engineers and is an active advisor consultant to the engineering staff at Criterium Engineers. We're all probably adept at Zoom meetings at this point. However, to review the presentation protocol, we brought you into the meeting on mute. We encourage you to ask questions on the chat function, and we'll try to get to some of the questions at the end of the presentation. If time does not allow us to address all the questions, we'll follow up with you. And again, we'll address questions over the chat and will not be opening up the presentation to verbal questions at this time. So your building and the coronavirus. So I have the chat, someone says that we can't see you and some of us can't hear you. So I don't have my video on, so probably you will not be able to see me, just the name. And some of us can't hear you. If you can't hear me very well, you may want to check the volume on your computer or your listening device. If some people can hear me and some people can't, it's probably specific to your meeting. If you continue to have that problem, you can even log out or leave the meeting and come back into the meeting, and it may reset whatever problem there was. So you're building in let's talk about buildings. So managing your building in the coronavirus world is a new challenge. What are your opportunities? So for buildings, to coordinate sanitation practices with owners and occupants, to provide social distancing solutions, to improve air quality with dilution and filtration, and to communicate your good faith efforts with occupants.
And this is Alan, just to jump in on that a little bit, but since we are focusing on the homeowner associations, community associations, just to emphasize that, you know, that whole notion of social distancing and establishing those standards. There's a lot of facilities, even in residential freestanding home type homeowner associations, where this can be applicable, whether it's clubhouses, amenities where you have people around pools, tennis courts, common areas like mailbox rooms, things like that. So there's all sorts of areas. It's easy to imagine issues with social distancing when you're in a high-rise condominium, but it applies equally to even the more spread out single-family home associations.
And especially because of, you know, the fact that a lot of people come into community associations for some of that social community endeavor. So that is something to start figuring out how to communicate with people on the social distancing piece. And where do you start? Because every building is different. So where do you start? You can inventory your building. Has the building been completely closed? Are there some special opening prevention measures you can consider? There are limits, there will be limits to what you can do, and so it's a matter of finding out what they are and taking advantage of where you don't have those limits.
And again, jumping in from an HOA standpoint, a lot of the condo associations and homeowner associations that we work with are conversions of older buildings, whether converted from apartments and converted from even large single-family homes that have been converted to 6- and 8-unit condominium-type associations. And it's worth knowing when you're starting to do that inventory, what are you starting with? You know, there may be limits, as Rebecca said, to what you can do, but it's particularly important to know if there's a history to that building. You know, what was that history and how might that affect the starting point in trying to bring more safety to it as well.
So what affects your opportunities? As Alan mentioned, the age of the building, whether or not it's new or it's 100 years old, would have some significant differences in how you go about some of those aspects. Types of windows, are they fixed? Are they not fixed? The HVAC system and that configuration. In the Northeast, there are lots of buildings that have heat only and hydronic systems, but what type of system do you have? If it's been an older building that's been renovated, maybe the HVAC, the air conditioning system is completely different than the heat system. So your occupant density, where are those places where there are high density people or traffic patterns, and the construction type and architectural features. So we have two conditions. We have opening buildings that maybe have been closed for a while, and we have buildings that may need some permanent changes as far as traffic patterns and different operating procedures. But when you prepare a closed building for opening, there's some things to think about. And this might be directly related to a lot of community spaces with homeowner association properties. Things to think about is flushing out the existing air with HVAC systems, fans, or open windows. Some of that air has been very stagnant. Some people probably have not, a lot of people have been in them, and certainly to flush out the air system would be recommended. Review the setbacks in operating temperatures and humidity. So if you have a clubhouse or a community space that had was on its own zone and it has been set back for the last month or two to conserve energy, make sure that's reviewed a couple days prior to opening and take a look at what those temperatures and humidity settings are. Flush out the potable water systems to eliminate any bacteria from stagnant water. Review your hot water set point temperatures. Again, maybe some property managers have set back some hot water set point temperatures to conserve energy while people weren't using those systems, so they need to be ramped back up to a safe level to kill that bacteria. And filling the drain traps. If drains aren't used for a long period of time, there's a trap in the plumbing system, and those sometimes the water will evaporate out of them, and it's a great place for bacteria and other and viruses in general to live. So making sure that those are filled back up.
And just to add to that a little bit in what Rebecca was saying, the flushing out of both the water and the air systems, give it plenty of time. I mean, it takes a while, depending on the size of the building, depending on the type of the system, and you really can't overdo, within reason obviously, but you really can't overdo flushing out the systems, especially if the property has been closed for some period of time. So I would just be aggressive about that process. If you've got a clubhouse, for example, that has been shut down for all practical purposes for a couple of months, running the systems for the air systems for 48 hours is not a bad thing, and the water system for at least, I would say, 6 hours or more is not a bad thing, just to make sure you're getting everything flushed out of the systems before the buildings are going to be occupied.
And even if it isn't a separate building, if there is a pool house or a pool building that has locker rooms, all of those areas where you have water running, they should be looked at to flush out. So once you have make your preparations to open the building, it's time to think about what you're going to do for maintaining social distancing. So consider traffic flow, consider the type of use, the density of people, and really take a look at where people bottleneck. So in particular, entrances, elevators, lobbies, or restrooms.
And in addition to that, as Rebecca said before, locker rooms, depending on the kind of facility that you have, common area restrooms that go along with those locker rooms or go along with the clubhouse if you're in that type of a complex. The mail rooms, I was in one of our client situations recently, and at particular times of the day, like right after the postman is there, the mailroom can be a pretty busy place, and they're typically small spaces, so it's sometimes overlooked, but it's equally important. And even outdoor spaces, patios and decks around pools and tennis courts, bocce courts, those are all places where some type of signage, some kind of effort to make it more conscious for people that social distancing matters and that they should be complying with reasonable guidelines.
An interesting thing to note here is that in the electronic world, a very big place for people to transfer files back and forth is called Dropbox. And I didn't realize that name came out of before everything was electronic. There used to be mail drop boxes, and now that is also being discussed as something to implement also as a way to facilitate less exchange with people. So the mail, UPS, FedEx having a specific drop box on properties so they do not have to come into the building as far and can drop those packages in a specific area that's not occupied. But it's
actually, in one of the other programs that Rebecca and I have participated in, that was on the similar subject, that was promoted by the EPA in collaboration with Energy Star, they were talking about Amazon actually providing the equivalent of a drop box to be in lobbies and addressing that same issue, just to make a place for people to drop things off so that other people can come pick it up without having direct contact or even close contact.
So along those same lines, can you close off common areas where people generally congregate? Can you modify the traffic flow in narrow corridors, make some of them one way? Can you encourage the use of stairs to reduce elevator usage? And can you add signs to limit elevator use to one person at a time?
And that's an important point too, because one of the things that we've learned in some of our other programs is that, individuals, if somebody's in an elevator and then the door opens and somebody's waiting to get in the elevator, both parties can be kind of uncomfortable with setting the standard for themselves. But if there's a sign there that recommends that there's only one person at a time, or at least one family unit at a time, it just takes away the awkwardness of that event when the door opens and there's one person in and one person out, and what do you do next? So I think the signage helps maintain compliance with the guideline, but it also makes life a little easier for the people using the space.
So to develop and implement a plan, define social distancing and include masks in locations and outline where those would be. Establish occupant density. So identify areas where there could be places where you want fewer people. Provide signage and communicate with the owners and occupants. And this is a pretty big, the communication piece, as Alan just pointed out. I don't think that we can underestimate the use of communication avenues and signage, whether or not it takes maybe a potentially awkward situation and makes it easier. Certainly will help people understand and deal with what's going on. So improving air quality. So what type of air system do you have? What type of HVAC system do you have? Is it heat only? Is that heat provided hydronically with water? Or are there air systems? Is there heat and air conditioning? And is that a combined or separate? Again, a lot of the older buildings have separate air conditioning and heat systems. For heat-only building, more use of operable windows. Do you have any mechanical ventilation, or can you install some? And what type of control system do you have? Can fans be increased, so the fans in your HVAC system, can they be increased, meaning speeds increased to increase ventilation, or on more of the time if there's a setback? So that would all be known in the control system. So with air, you want to dilute the air and filter the air. So look for areas to dilute the air. Can you increase the outside air? And that includes opening dampers. A lot of HVAC systems that have ductwork and air systems have dampers that will provide fresh air ventilation. And those dampers can be increased to increase the amount of air coming in. Those systems also commonly have a recirculation loop, so not all of the air coming into the space is from the outside. Some of it has been recirculated through the system. And so are there places where you can eliminate that recirculation? Can you flush the building? As we mentioned earlier, when you open the building after it's been closed for a little while, then Can you flush it? And should you put that as part of your regular maintenance routine for the building? Do you have operable windows? And if you do, establish a schedule for keeping them open when the weather permits. Can you keep restroom fans running during occupied hours? As we're going to talk about a little bit, then that's a pretty important piece. And restroom vent fans will pull the air out of the room. They exhaust directly to the outside. None of the air that gets pulled out of the restrooms gets recirculated back into the building. So that air that gets pulled out of the restroom is directly to the outside. So can you keep those fans running during occupied hours? And should you keep them operating maybe during unoccupied hours? Is the air shared? So if you have multiple tenants or multiple spaces where people are occupying them, are those air systems independent or are they shared?
And that's an important thing to keep in mind as it relates to condominium conversions in particular, you know, whether they used to be an apartment building or a large single-family home or any number of buildings that we all know about over the years that have been converted to condominiums, because a lot of times the heating and air conditioning systems in those buildings served larger areas before the conversion. And I've been in a number of buildings in the Northeast that if you really start to analyze the air system, and a lot of these, of course, if they also have air conditioning, they're going to have an air system, and you find out that the air system is not unique to one or distinct to one particular condominium. It might be shared by multiple condominiums. So it brings up another point on this whole subject that Rebecca is talking about, that first of all, make sure that you do have air systems that are specific to each space that's being managed, so you're not diluting the air from one space with air from another space. But that also speaks to the whole notion of just getting to know the system in your building. A lot of folks, you know, whether it's managers and dealing with homeowner associations that are high-rise or single-family with clubhouses, but not everybody that manages or owns these properties really understand the systems that are taking care of heating and air conditioning and ventilation in those properties. So this is an opportunity to get, you know, take the gloves off, so to speak, and really get involved in understanding the system in your building and figuring out how it does mix outside air with inside air and how it does exchange air between different adjacent spaces, and get to know it, and you know, because even to be specific with your mechanical system technicians, that if you're asking them to improve things, you want to be able to be very specific about what you're asking. Just to simply say, you know, let me have more ventilation in today's world with all the challenges of coronavirus isn't always going to be enough. You need to be more specific, which means having a good understanding of the system to begin with.
It's a great point, Alan, and again, to reiterate, every building is not only specific, you know, for a plan. Every building is different, I guess I'm trying to say, but each HVAC design is different. If you have a building and it's so many square feet, compare it to another building of so many square feet, the HVAC systems are likely not going to be the same, even though they have the same indoor space. So it's very specific to your building. A lot of questions have come up because we're looking to dilute the air with more outside air. That there's an efficiency factor here because the fact that a lot of systems have been designed in the last particularly 10 to 15 years with an eye towards increasing efficiency. And how you increase efficiency is you don't bring in as much outside air. You try to reuse that indoor air because it doesn't have as much heating and cooling required of it. But as we're finding, you know, some of these recommendations that are coming out of the industry are to increase the outdoor air, what does that do to your efficiency? Well, Energy Star has started to put together some of those preliminary calculations, and basically some of their calculations they've done, they took 5 geographic locations around the country and did an average, and with increasing ventilation, they had, and bringing in more outside air, they've calculated on average it will result in 3 to 5% increase in energy use. So it's not going to be a huge impact on energy usage. So as we talk about and others talk about bringing more outside air in, the expectation is that it's not, if you bring in 50% more air, you're not going to increase your energy use by 50%. It's actually small compared. So in the dilution and filtration piece, you want to look for areas to improve your filtration. Can you keep your circulation fans running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Again, a lot of control systems ratchet back the fans during unoccupied hours, so can you keep those fans running? What type of filter does your system have? If possible, you want to upgrade to a MERV 13, and that's a rating of a type of filter. You want to replace the filters at least quarterly. You want to inspect the ductwork for leaks and filter bypass. And a couple comments about filters. MERV 8 is a lower quality filter, or it doesn't filter as fine of an item as MERV 13. MERV 8 is a very common rating for a filter in most air systems. So MERV, if you are able to upgrade to a MERV 13, you have the impact of a couple things. The MERV 13 does require more pressure to go across that filter, so you're going to end up with a higher pressure drop. And so therefore you may need to have your fan speeds increased to maintain the same airflow through your system. And inspecting the ductwork for leaks, that's a great thing to do in any environment. But the filter bypass, and an interesting statistic that I have heard recently also, I think from Energy Star, was that a half-inch gap on a filter can result in 25% bypass. So if you have a filter, MERV 13 filter in there, which is catching a lot of these particles that you want to catch, but yet you have a half-inch gap around the filter, then you are losing 25% of the air that should go through the filter. So that's an important piece too. So inspect the ductwork for leaks and filter bypass.
And just to add a little bit to that before we wrap up with this slide and to supplement what Rebecca just said, the folks have asked in other sessions we've done about how easy is it to replace like the MERV 8 filter with the MERV 13, and being a building owner myself and having just made that conversion, I can tell you that it's really quite simple as long as there's access to the equipment, which most equipment would be accessible just because it needs to be maintained regularly. The physical size of the MERV 13 filter is virtually the same as the MERV 8. It's the filtering capability that is different. So it took us, in a 22,000 square foot building, it took us about 2 hours to change all the filters to the MERV 13.
And when you're filtering, when you're changing those filters out, when you're doing any sort of work on the HVAC system, there is a need for those individuals to be wearing personal protective equipment because now you could potentially be handling contaminated filters. And so they also need to be properly contained and disposed of. So for air quality, develop a plan for improving the air quality and communicate your plan to the owners and occupants. You know, circulate a detailed memo, put up that signage, identify the modifications that you've made, demonstrate the good faith effort, and have your building owners and occupants understand that the safety is the highest priority. So it's important to provide a safe environment in our coronavirus world. We all know that, and understanding where you're starting with your building is the first step. And once you understand what your limits are and where your potential is, you can implement the thoughtful programs and communicate with the building users and owners. So in summary, sanitize and disinfect. We've all heard a lot about sanitization and disinfection, and that is the highest priority. Implement social distancing by managing traffic flow in the building, especially in narrow hallways and elevators and high traffic areas. Establish occupant density levels so people understand what the goal is. You want to dilute the air. Dilute it by increasing the outdoor air, which is ventilation. You want to keep your air systems running when you can, and that could require a control system change. Keep your restrooms ventilated with mechanical ventilation. Inspect any heat recovery equipment to make sure the leakages are under control, so that would be part of your ventilation system. Avoid recirculation and encourage the use of operable windows. In filtering the air, replace the air filters more frequently, inspect and prevent that filter bypass, and install the MERV 13 filters when possible. And again, every building is different. Some are more limited than others, but the objective is an effective good faith effort.
And I would just add to that, too, that as we've been talking in other programs that Rebecca and I have presented and have participated in, be conscious when you're thinking about common spaces, be particularly conscious about places that people are making contact, not with each other, but with the physical aspects of the building. Those congested areas, you know, there's folks that have been establishing programs of having staff members that are cleaning specific areas that are high-touch areas on a regular basis, and in some of the common areas and clubhouses and so on, and in homeowner associations and high-rise, whether it's a separate building as a clubhouse or just another part of the building that you're in. Just be conscious. Watch how people use the space and see, you know, where they're making contact, whether it's with doors, walls, counters. There's other programs that talk about what you do with sign-in, and it's just being conscious about how people use the building and make contact with it. And depending on the frequency of that contact, it may be a matter of having somebody that's actually disinfecting those surfaces on an hourly basis if it's a high density area and a lot of people making contact. If it's much less used, then obviously it might only be daily, maybe not even necessarily daily, but it's just how people are using the building is part of this whole consciousness program, and standing back and just watching people go through the building will show you a lot of things that you can do that you might not have thought of before.
So in looking at some of our questions, one of them is, what are best practices on requirements to impose on contractors who enter the association to make repairs and unit owner renovations? I think there are a couple good answers to this. I think that in a lot of ways, I know that state by state there are coming up with some requirements. Also, OSHA is right on it to determine, what those requirements should be too. So at this point in time, I'm not sure that there is a great collection of best practices. A lot of the building and construction industry is putting them together right now. One of the things would be to find out what the local requirements are for the state. For instance, I know here in the state of Maine, anybody who goes into a residence to do any sort of inspection, at least, it requires booties, foot covers to be on their feet. And then the other pieces as far as masks and other type of safety equipment. So a lot of companies are also putting together requirements. So I think at this point, it may be a little premature to say that there's one good place to go for best practices. It might be something that as an association, you may want to get together and put together requirements for your property. And just start discussing what is out there for guidance from the state and also OSHA, and decide what you want to do also.
And I think to add to that, and I agree with everything Rebecca just said, in addition, having been a president of a condominium association myself, and we spend time working with hundreds of associations from a management standpoint, working with the boards, and I think it's, if only for the liability of the board and the management of that association, but also in the spirit of keeping the occupants safe, I think that some sort of standard, even while you're working on developing perhaps a more comprehensive standard, some sort of standard should be available from the association right away to whenever any work is being done, that you are proactive as an association saying, these are the minimum standards that we expect you to comply with as a contractor coming onto this site. It may only be maybe just a statement that say that, we want your written confirmation that you're going to comply with the applicable state standards. It may be as general as that, but it's still a proactive position by the association saying that we expect you to be conscious of, what's expected out there in the world right now. And then as you develop more of your own, that becomes part of that transaction every time somebody new comes on the site. And it's important to be proactive about this whole process. So I think at a minimum it would be making the statement that you expect compliance with the applicable standards in your state.
The next question, is there a minimum amount of outside air to circulate per hour or day that we should aim for? So buildings are the amount of air changes per hour, ACH, is a common industry term that is used to talk about how many air changes per hour. And again, that number has been decreasing all along for energy efficiency. Probably 30 years ago, it would not be uncommon for a building to have 7, 8, 9 air changes per hour. And nowadays, actual codes are requiring as low as 3 air changes per hour. Obviously, the lower number, the more energy efficient, but the higher number gives more outside air that comes in, which is a better dilution. And so I would say the average right now is probably a 7. And should you aim for something different? It might be difficult to change that. Going into the HVAC system and identifying what controls you have, whether or not it's actual increasing dampers so that it brings in more outside air. But certainly, 7 I think still is a very, between 5 and 7 is a number that is not going to affect your energy consumption too much, but it would allow you to have a good indoor air comfort for the occupants. Another question, what impact does filtration have in reducing coronavirus? I thought this did not reduce the presence of the virus, just dust particles. Well, the coronavirus, this current pandemic, SARS-2 virus, has a size of 0.125 micron nuclei. And so what that means is that a filter, it needs to catch something that size to have it effective. A MERV 8 filter, which again we talked about, it was the most common size, will not catch anything that size. But it will catch some because this coronavirus attaches itself also to dust particles, and those dust particles can be of a size that a MERV 8 filter will catch. The MERV 13 catches 50% of items that are that size of the coronavirus. So a MERV 13 filter will catch any coronavirus particle that is on another dust particle, and it will catch 50% of the particles that are the size of the coronavirus. A MERV 14 filter will catch 75% of it, and a HEPA filter will catch 89% of what goes through it that is the size of a COVID-19. So to answer your question, it won't catch all of them, the MERV 13, but filters do increase the amount of what they'll catch of particles of both the COVID-19 and also dust particles that may have it on it. How is financial analysis affected by COVID-19 on fees? I think that's a great question, and I think that's something that again, I'm not sure that it's been around long enough to come to any conclusions on that, and I also think that it would depend a lot on the association and the buildings to determine how that effect is going to happen on them.
And I would just add to that a little bit that, again, from having been on the management side for condo associations, and we've helped develop thousands of reserve funds for associations, and I think that right now, for most buildings, although as Rebecca said, this whole process is a matter of figuring out where you're starting and what your options are, and what's practical and realistic with the buildings that you have. In most cases, improving ventilation and both by changing filters and by running fans longer periods of time and stuff like that. Most of the cost on things like that is really nominal. I mean, the difference between a MERV 13 filter and a MERV 8 filter is about a factor of 3, but at the same time, that's $7 or $8 versus $3 or $4. And unless you've got hundreds of those filters throughout your complex, the net effect isn't going to be that great. I think so. I think for the most part, you can do a lot without spending a lot when it comes to improving, the safety of the buildings. If you start to get into major system modifications with, if there's no exhaust air or no outside air exchangers or anything like that, then of course that's going to be costly, but that starts to come under the heading of a capital improvement, and that would be a board-approved exercise and would need to be justified before the money was spent. But for the most part, you can do a lot without spending a lot.
The next question I see here, in a building with central air, is there any other recommendations other than increasing the MERV rating for filters? Because some owners are concerned about air circulation during AC use. So yeah, some of the things we talked about as far as making, eliminating any recirculation, those would be something to talk to the HVAC servicing company about. In addition to that, the idea of using, flushing the building or increasing the fan speed so that a lot of the air gets turned over faster. And so I think there are some ways that, again, other than just increasing the MERV rating, you can take a look at controlling the building a little bit differently so that there's more turnover and more outside air that's brought into the system. Well, I thank you all for joining us today, and if anything else comes up, you can certainly email us and we can get back with you. And good luck to all of you, and thank you for joining us.